Pilot refuses to let black woman board. Seconds later, she fires him as the airline CEO. A tense hush settled over Gate 49 at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. That moment, right before an impossible storm unleashes itself. Boarding announcements crackled overhead while weary passengers clutched their tickets, hoping to squeeze onto a crowded flight. Yet, in the midst of shuffling feet and heavy sighs, an unsettling confrontation brewed. A neatly uniformed pilot stepped forward, glaring at a well-dressed black woman who stood poised with confidence. His jaw tightened, words forming behind clenched teeth. Onlookers froze, uncertain of what might happen. Few realized the next few minutes would change everything for him, for her, and for the entire airline. An autumn morning dawned bright and clear in Atlanta. Travelers bustled through the terminals of the Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, their rolling suitcases click-clacking over tiled floors. Sunlight streamed through massive glass windows, illuminating the serpentine lines of security checkpoints. The airport was nearly always busy after all. It was the largest airport in the world by passenger volume. People came from every corner of the globe, converging in these halls for connecting flights, business trips, reunions, and personal journeys. Among them walked Cassandra Lewis, a quietly influential executive whose polished demeanor turned heads wherever she went. She carried a discreet black leather briefcase, her outfit tastefully professional but not flashy. She was no stranger to airports or travel. As the newly appointed Chief Executive Officer of Skycruise Airlines, she'd learned to navigate crowds with ease, exuding both warmth and authority. Arriving early for a flight she intended to observe in person, Cassandra planned to blend in with the passengers, assess the airline's operations discreetly, and eventually step aboard the plane to meet the crew. Despite the airline's name not yet being as globally recognized as giants like Delta or United, Skycruise was on a rapid ascent, boasting a modern fleet and generous customer service policies. Cassandra's mission was to transform it into one of the most beloved airlines in the industry, a beacon of innovation and respect. She had been appointed precisely because of her visionary leadership style, equal parts, compassionate listening, and strategic sharpness. Her entire staff knew she was hands-on. To them, her presence in day-to-day operations was normal, and they admired her for it. What Cassandra did not know was that on this fateful morning, tensions from multiple angles were converging. A pilot named James Corbin, a man she had never formally met, was scheduled to captain the very flight she was about to board. He'd heard rumors that higher-ups might be traveling incognito to observe staff conduct, but he assumed the executive would be a man, or at least someone from the board he might vaguely recognize. The idea that the CEO might be a black woman simply never occurred to him. James Corbin was a skilled pilot, the type of man who prided himself on technical expertise. In his younger days, he had soared through flight school with accolades. His uniform was always crisp, his tie always perfectly knotted, his hair trimmed to regulation standards. Yet behind this polished exterior lurked layers of discontent, shaped by years of harboring unspoken biases and frustrations. He was the sort of person who believed wholeheartedly in a certain chain of command, but only so long as it came in forms he recognized. Unbeknownst to many, James had grown bitter about perceived changes in corporate culture, especially the push for diversity and inclusion. He grumbled privately that certain hires were box-checking moves rather than legitimate accomplishments. On that particular morning, James was nursing a fresh resentment. He had not been promoted to a management position in the flight operations department. Instead, the role had gone to a younger, very qualified female pilot named Leticia Ramirez, who had less total flight time but had excelled in leadership, simulation tests, and knowledge of advanced avionics. The selection committee's process had been transparent and based on a point system. Still, James told himself that it was all about optics and that he'd been overlooked because he was just another middle-aged white guy. This sense of unfairness simmered under the surface, festering. That undercurrent of tension wound tighter when James caught sight of Cassandra stepping through the gate area. He didn't recognize her as the company's new CEO, largely because she was not making any show of importance, no entourage, no formal introduction, just a single flight attendant acknowledging her presence with a respectful, almost imperceptible nod. Instead, James saw only a well-dressed black woman carrying a top-tier first-class ticket. Something inside him twisted, an irrational flash of suspicion, the notion that she might be another beneficiary of the inclusive policies he resented. It was an ugly thought, but the spark of prejudice struck him like flint against steel, igniting a rash of misguided actions that would soon derail his entire career. The day began with minor complications for James. During the pre-flight checks, he learned that a small mechanical glitch in the auxiliary power unit, APU, threatened to delay the flight. A confluence of poor communication and incomplete paperwork meant he was already starting to sweat. Skycruise prided itself on timeliness, and delayed departures risked negative ratings. For someone as high-strung as James, the frustration built quickly. He blamed the mechanics. He blamed the ground crew. He blamed the new corporate emphasis on safety checks that took longer than he felt were necessary. In truth, his own oversight had contributed to the confusion. James had neglected to file a timely request for an additional ground power unit. The mechanical staff, following standard protocols, had spent valuable minutes trying to fix the glitch before letting him know the flight could actually proceed with external power. Throughout the fiasco, James's temper flared. By the time he reached the gate area to observe the boarding process, his nerves were wound like a clock spring near its breaking point. Cassandra, on the other hand, had arrived at the gate calm and collected. She sensed the slight tension in the airports, often brimmed with anxious energy. But something felt off. In the waiting area, she observed an older man in a pilot's uniform glancing in her direction. She offered him a polite smile, but he responded by turning away abruptly. She chalked it up to him being busy or preoccupied. At this point, she had no idea the man's name was James Corbin, nor that he was the captain of her flight. Soon enough, an announcement came over the speakers. Skycruise Flight 237 to New York LaGuardia is now ready for pre-boarding. We will begin with families traveling with small children and anyone needing extra time or assistance. Cassandra waited patiently. She was in no hurry to rush the gate. She planned to board closer to the final call, as she wanted to speak briefly with a few staff members and possibly chat with a passenger or two. If she made her presence known in the premium cabin too early, she'd risk overshadowing the normal check-in procedures. Still, she glanced at her watch. The flight appeared to be running about 10 minutes behind. It wasn't a significant delay, but she wondered if everything was running smoothly. James, standing behind the gate agent, was mentally stewing. His day had begun poorly, and the mere sight of Cassandra seemed to fan the embers of his resentment. A voice in his head whispered that he had to remain professional. But his frustration was so intense that each new wave of boarding passengers felt like an intrusion on his attempt to fix the day's problems. The gate agent, a capable young professional named Andrew, noticed James's grim face and gave him a concerned look. Andrew asked, "Everything okay, Captain Corbin?" James forced a smile that looked more like a grimace. "Just peachy. Let's keep it moving," he replied. Andrew nodded, turning back to scan tickets. James saw Cassandra move from the seats toward the gate. She carried herself with poised confidence, which somehow infuriated James all the more. An irrational voice in his mind insisted she must be some VIP or influencer traveling on a comped ticket. as if her presence alone was a direct challenge to him, a personal affront. That was the destructive power of prejudice. It twisted James's perception, turning a routine passenger into a symbol of all his resentments. At last, it was Cassandra's turn to board. She approached the gate, greeting Andrew with a warm smile. "Good morning," she said. "How's everything looking today?" Andrew hesitated a moment, as he had been informed the new CEO might be traveling incognito, but he wasn't entirely certain if this was the same person. He responded courteously, "All good, ma'am. We're just a little delayed, but the flight should go smoothly from here." James edged closer, curious about Cassandra's ticket. When Andrew scanned it, the system confirmed a first-class seat, 1A. The seat typically reserved for airline VIPs or paying customers who valued top-tier comfort. James's suspicion flared. With barely veiled hostility, he stared at Cassandra. She noticed immediately. Cassandra, not one to shrink from discomfort, turned to James with a direct but composed expression. "Is something the matter?" she asked. In that instant, James couldn't hold back the surge of frustration that had been boiling all morning, and perhaps for months or years prior. He snapped. "Ma'am, we have a certain procedure for premium class. Are you certain you're in the right boarding group?" A hush fell over the nearby passengers. Cassandra's eyebrows lifted, taken aback by his accusatory tone. "I'm fairly certain," she said, politely but firmly, glancing at Andrew. The young gate agent's eyes widened, sensing danger. He knew precisely who this passenger was, or at least strongly suspected. But James seemed oblivious. James pressed on. "We can't just let anyone waltz into first class without verifying. We're past special pre-boarding. Do you have any kids with you or special assistance needs?" Cassandra stood taller. "I'm neither traveling with children nor do I need special assistance. My ticket is right here, though the gate agent already scanned it. Is there a particular reason you're questioning me?" The tone of her voice was measured, but underlined with a note of steely calm. A few passengers, noticing the tension, stopped in their tracks. One older woman nearby frowned at James, while a younger couple looked at each other in confusion. Andrew, feeling the atmosphere crackle, tried to intervene. "Captain Corbin, Miss Lewis is all set." "Let's—" James cut him off, pointing a finger at Cassandra. "I don't like your attitude. And if you're going to stand there questioning me, maybe you should wait. I'll have security verify you. I'm not risking any issues at 35,000 feet because of some possible ticket mix-up." Andrew's heart pounded. He knew the truth. Miss Cassandra Lewis was the new CEO, and James Corbin was a pilot who had no idea he was about to commit the biggest career mistake of his life. Andrew's words caught in his throat. Fear of interrupting the pilot or challenging him in front of passengers froze him momentarily. Meanwhile, Cassandra recognized that the situation was escalated by prejudice and anger rather than rational concerns. She tried to speak in a conciliatory way. "Captain, there's a misunderstanding here. Let's—" He jabbed a hand toward the waiting area. "MAAM, step aside. I won't have you boarding this aircraft until we clear this up." Now, a collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Cassandra's eyes flashed with shock and, to a lesser extent, indignation. She locked eyes with Andrew, who shook himself out of his stupor. He quickly turned to James. "Sir, that's not necessary. Her ticket is legitimate. I personally verified it." "There is no again," James interrupted. "I said step aside." It was then that Cassandra decided enough was enough. She had intended to keep a low profile, to observe quietly. But this pilot was stepping into grounds for disciplinary action. She took a slow breath, re-centering herself. With unwavering composure, she spoke clearly so that both James and Andrew could hear. "Captain Corbin, is it? I would ask you to maintain professionalism. You're speaking with Cassandra Lewis, and as of last month, I am the CEO of Skycruise Airlines." If you have concerns, I'd be more than willing to address them after we ensure a timely boarding for all these passengers." Her words struck like a thunderbolt. Andrew blinked, swallowing. Other passengers looked from Cassandra to the pilot, expressions shifting from curiosity to outright astonishment. For a split second, James stood stock still, absorbing the revelation. Then his face darkened, the color draining before he flushed red. The truth hammered at his mind. This woman, the target of his prejudice, was actually the top executive of the entire airline, the very person who signed his checks, who oversaw his promotions, who had the power to end or elevate his career in the blink of an eye. But in his heightened emotional state, James lashed out one more time, doubling down on his miscalculation. "I don't care who you say you are. I haven't seen any proof. Anyone can claim something. For all I know, you could be an impersonator or a threat to flight security. I'm the captain, and I have the authority to deny boarding to any passenger who I believe poses a risk or fails to comply with crew instructions. So you can either stand down and wait, or you're not getting on my flight." That final outburst ignited a wave of murmurs among the crowd. Andrew looked horrified, staring at Cassandra for guidance. In that moment, Cassandra's stance grew icier, but her voice remained remarkably steady. "If you truly believe that, then, Captain, I will comply with your instructions to step aside. But let me assure you, I will be taking immediate steps to address this." With that, Cassandra moved away from the gate, pulling out her phone. She walked a few paces down the corridor, already speed dialing another executive. Andrew, speechless, watched as the situation spiraled beyond anything he could have imagined. Meanwhile, James wore a triumphant smirk, as if he had successfully protected the flight from a perceived intrusion. Passengers gawked. Nobody knew precisely what to do. James gave Andrew a curt nod, as if to say, "Let's keep boarding." The boarding process resumed awkwardly, with Andrew half-heartedly calling for business-class passengers. People filed past, stealing furtive glances at James, who stood with rigid posture, arms folded. He tried to maintain a veneer of command, but beneath it, a kernel of doubt sprouted. Even if that woman truly was the CEO, he told himself, it was better to be safe than sorry. He believed, or tried to believe, that he was within his rights, yet guilt nagged at him. He had never seen the new CEO in person, but he vaguely recalled an email. The incoming CEO was a highly decorated executive from a major competitor airline, recognized as an African-American woman. Could that have been her? Trying to quell the sinking feeling, James rationalized, if she was really that important, she would have come with an entourage, or at least introduced herself properly. He took solace in the memory that corporate bigwigs typically didn't board like regular passengers. But maybe that was outdated logic. Who knew how this new CEO operated? Meanwhile, across the terminal corridor, Cassandra was speaking in hushed tones over the phone with David Connolly, Skycruise's chief operating officer. He picked up on the second ring, his voice tinged with genuine alarm as Cassandra relayed the situation. David knew James Corbin by reputation. The pilot was competent, but had garnered some reports of unfriendly behavior. If Cassandra was being treated in such a disrespectful manner, it meant the airline's cultural issues ran deeper than they'd feared. David insisted that Cassandra let him handle it immediately, but she made it clear she intended to address it in person as well. Their conversation ended with David promising to coordinate with ground staff. No more than 5 minutes had passed, but for James, it felt both swift and unbearably long. Andrew finished scanning the last group of passengers and prepared to close the gate. Cassandra was still on the phone, her expression unreadable. The tension was thick enough to taste. Then, from the corner of his eye, James saw an airline representative hurrying down the corridor, someone from management. given her uniform. The woman approached Cassandra first, spoke a few words, then looked sharply at James. She seemed both anxious and furious. James tried to keep his composure, but beads of sweat dotted his forehead. The next thing he knew, the manager, whose name tag read Paula Simmons, strode up to him. "Captain Corbin," she said with forced politeness, "we've just been informed that you refused boarding to Cassandra Lewis, Skycruise's chief executive officer. Is that correct?" He cleared his throat, stiffened. "I refused boarding to a passenger whose identity was not verified and who questioned my authority at the gate. I had legitimate concerns." Paula's eyes narrowed. "I see. Captain, I'm afraid we need you to step away and speak with corporate security immediately." James's heart hammered. "You can't do that. I can, and I will. Miss Lewis will be taking this flight as planned, but you, Captain Corbin, are relieved from duty until further notice." For a moment, James was struck dumb. The manager's words echoed in his mind, relieved from duty. This was beyond a mere scolding. The pilots' union representative wasn't even present, and he was losing command of the flight right here and now, in front of staff and passengers. "Wait, you can't just—" he began, but Paula stood firm. Skycruise policy clearly states that any pilot can be removed from duty if there is reason to believe they pose a liability risk to the airline or its customers. Your confrontation with Miss Lewis constitutes a serious breach. You'll have a chance to defend your actions with HR and union representatives, but at this time, you are not flying Flight 237. I have another pilot coming to replace you." James swallowed his indignation, humiliation flooding him. Passengers in the boarding lounge openly watched. Some recorded with their phones, capturing every second. Andrew looked both relieved and terrified. Then, almost as if in slow motion, Cassandra ended her phone call and walked toward them. Her face bore no triumph or rage, just a cool, measured expression. "Captain Corbin," she said quietly, "I would rather not cause a scene here, but I expect you to comply with Miss Simmons's instructions and stand down from this flight." James forced a nod, words choked in his throat. He wanted to lash out, to claim he was the real victim, but the presence of onlooking passengers and staff, combined with the dawning horror of what he'd done, held him silent. His face burned as he realized the severity of his fate. Slowly, James stepped away from the gate, unhooked his pilot's badge, and placed it in Paula's hand. She gestured for him to follow her out of the terminal area, presumably to answer for his conduct. Cassandra maintained her composure until James was out of sight. Then she gestured to Andrew. "Andrew, please reopen the gate for a moment. I'd like to address any remaining concerns our passengers might have. We'll make sure they board and depart as soon as possible." Passengers who witnessed the ordeal stood in awe as Cassandra took a moment to speak calmly over the intercom, apologizing for the brief disturbance and thanking everyone for their patience. She explained that there had been a misunderstanding with a staff member who was now being replaced for the flight, and she assured them that their journey was a priority. Her voice was steady and comforting, revealing exactly why she'd earned her leadership role. Under pressure, she remained the epitome of grace. Cassandra finally boarded Flight 237, taking seat 1A. The new pilot, Captain Letitia Ramirez, the very individual James Corbin had resented, arrived swiftly, summoned from her stand by post. Although Letitia had just stepped off a flight from Chicago that morning and was due for a short break, she couldn't deny the request when the airline's crew called her personally, explaining the emergency. She hurried through the terminal, adrenaline surging with the knowledge that something serious had happened, though she didn't yet know all the details. The flight attendants, many of whom had overheard rumors of the fiasco, sprang into action to ensure everything was ready for an on-time departure, or at least as close to on time as possible. They welcomed Cassandra with professional courtesy, But behind their measured smiles, they wondered how shaken she might be. In truth, Cassandra felt a swirl of emotions, anger, disappointment, and a renewed sense of purpose. She recognized that Pilot Corbin's attitude was likely not an isolated case. It was a sign that deeper cultural changes were still needed at Sky Cruise. Once the aircraft doors were sealed and the plane pushed back from the gate, Cassandra exhaled. She gazed out the window as ground crews in neon vests directed the plane to the runway, her mind replaying the confrontation. For a fleeting moment, she questioned whether she should have tried diffusing the situation differently. But the logic was plain. No matter how calmly she had spoken, James Corbin's bias had been set like stone in that moment. Perhaps he was carrying emotional baggage that had little to do with her personally. But that hardly justified threatening to remove a perfectly valid ticketed passenger from the flight. Throughout the safety demonstration, Cassandra took mental notes on how the cabin crew handled it. If there was a silver lining to the morning's drama, it was that she could continue her incognito observations about other facets of the airline experience. Passengers around her were a bit unsettled, so she gave them reassuring smiles when they glanced her way, trying to ease the tension. Captain Ramirez's voice came over the intercom. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Ramirez. Welcome aboard Sky Cruise Flight 237 to New York LaGuardia. We apologize for the slight delay. We'll do our best to make up some time in the air. We appreciate your patience and look forward to a safe and pleasant flight." Hearing Letitia's calm, authoritative tone, Cassandra felt a sense of pride. She knew Letitia was one of Sky Cruise's rising stars, someone who represented the new wave of leadership the airline desperately needed. Cassandra made a mental note to commend Letitia later. Soon enough, the plane took off, ascending through scattered clouds before leveling out at cruising altitude. Flight attendants began distributing drinks and snacks in the first-class cabin. Cassandra politely declined the alcoholic beverages, asking instead for sparkling water. She couldn't quite shake off the earlier confrontation. After the seatbelt sign was turned off, Cassandra took out her tablet, intending to draft an internal memo about the incident. She wanted to detail the situation while it was still fresh in her mind, but her reflection went deeper than a mere complaint. She decided to propose a thorough review of diversity and inclusion training, conflict resolution protocols, and especially the chain of command processes that allowed a pilot to act so brazenly without immediate checks. The swift response from Paula Simmons had been reassuring, but the fact that the confrontation happened at all exposed gaps in the airline's workplace culture. While Cassandra soared toward New York, back in Atlanta, James Corbin found himself in a cramped conference room with Paula Simmons, a representative from HR, and a union advisor. The setting felt surreal. Just hours earlier, James had been preparing to pilot a routine flight. Now he was being questioned, forced to explain his version of events. He started out defensive, claiming he was only following safety protocol, but Paula Simmons wasn't having it. "Captain Corbin," Paula said firmly, "we have multiple witnesses, passengers, the gate agent, even a recording on someone's phone that you singled out Miss Lewis and raised your voice. You insisted she was not permitted to board, even after the gate agent verified her ticket. And when you were informed of her identity, you effectively called her a liar." The union advisor tried to intervene. "Let's keep this factual. Captain Corbin states he was unaware of Miss Lewis's identity and was prioritizing flight safety." Paula's stare turned icy. The airline's stance is that safety protocol does not require humiliating or singling out a passenger for no valid reason, especially when the gate agent confirmed her seat. "We strongly suspect bias influenced his actions." James glared at the floor, stony silence his only defense. Deep down, he knew he had let his prejudices and frustrations override rational behavior. But he still clung to the idea that he was the victim of unfair corporate policies. His own shame battled with his pride. The HR representative spelled out the possible consequences: immediate suspension pending a formal investigation, with a high likelihood of termination for cause. That phrase, termination for cause, struck James like a blow to the gut. It meant he could lose his job without severance or benefits, possibly blacklisted from other airlines if the reason for termination was severe enough. Panic welled up inside him. "I've given 15 years of dedicated service to this airline," he said, voice trembling with anger. "All to be undone by some overreaction?" Paula's voice was unyielding. "Captain, you physically barred the CEO from boarding the plane. That is not an overaction on our part. And the airline has been increasingly clear about respect and diversity in the workplace. Your actions showed blatant disregard for those principles." The meeting ended with James ordered to hand over his company credentials, including any pilot's manuals or proprietary documents, and sign an acknowledgement that he was on unpaid suspension. The union advisor quietly reminded him that they would try to negotiate or at least push for a fair hearing, but the tension in the room was unmistakable. James left with his shoulders sagging, escorted out of the building by security personnel. For him, the day had devolved into a nightmare he could never have foreseen. By the time Cassandra's flight landed at LaGuardia, news of the incident had leaked onto social media. Several passengers had recorded partial videos of the confrontation. Some had recognized Cassandra Lewis, or at least suspected she was someone important given the aftermath. Others simply posted about the bizarre scenario of a pilot refusing to let a woman board, only to discover she was the CEO. The story quickly gained traction. Pilot refuses to let black woman board seconds. Later, she fires him as the airline's CEO. Tabloid websites ran sensational headlines, though many got basic details wrong. Some accused skycrews of allowing racism in the cockpit. Others lauded the CEO for taking a stand. Hashtags trended briefly on Twitter. The entire ordeal threatened to overshadow any positive press the airline had hoped to garner for its new routes and updated amenities. David Connolly, the coup, frantically managed calls from journalists seeking official statements. He carefully reiterated that the pilot in question had been immediately suspended and that the company was cooperating with an internal investigation. The main goal, as David understood from Cassandra's phone call, was not to sensationalize the event, but to address it transparently and ensure accountability. When Cassandra stepped off the plane in New York, she was greeted by a small entourage of Skycruise employees, some from corporate offices in Manhattan. They led her to a private lounge. Cameras flashed. A reporter or two had already arrived, trying to catch her for an impromptu interview. She declined interviews at that moment, stating simply, "We're handling this internally, and our focus remains on providing safe, respectful, and high-quality service to all passengers." Yet Cassandra understood that ignoring the public outcry wasn't an option, so she decided to hold a brief press conference the next day. This would allow her to address the matter openly, clarify the airline's position, and reaffirm a commitment to respectful service and inclusivity. She spent part of the night drafting notes, coordinating with the airline's PR team, and touching base with David Connolly, ensuring everyone was on the same page. That evening, she checked into a nearby hotel, mind racing. She called her husband, Calvin, who was at home in Atlanta. He offered comforting words, telling her how proud he was of her composure and strength. She also spoke with her teenage daughter, Aaliyah, who had seen snippets of the story online and was worried about her mum. Cassandra reassured her that she was okay. Afterwards, Cassandra spent an hour going through email after email from employees within Skycruise. Some were messages of support, others from concerned staff who worried about the airline's reputation. Sensing the significance of the moment, she resolved that this incident, though painful, could become a catalyst for deeper cultural change. Back in Atlanta, James Corbin returned to his modest suburban home, a place he once took pride in. The front lawn was tidy, flowers in bloom. Inside, however, the atmosphere was tense. His wife, Marjorie, had caught wind of the fiasco. She tried to be supportive, but she was also deeply confused and upset. "James, how could you not recognize the new CEO?" she asked, exasperated. They sent company-wide emails with her photo and background when she was hired. He flushed. I just didn't expect her to be." His voice trailed off. The unspoken words were there. He hadn't expected the CEO to be a black woman. Marjorie pressed her lips together, unsure whether to scold him or console him. The two had been married for over a decade. She knew he had his prejudices, but she never believed it would jeopardize his career so spectacularly. James recounted the day's events in broken pieces, pacing around the living room. "The mechanical delay, the stress, her attitude, everything just got to me," he rationalized. "I was trying to follow protocol. This is all being blown out of proportion." Marjorie shook her head, tears threatening. "It's not out of proportion, James. This is your job, your reputation. I don't know how we'll handle this if you're fired. We have the mortgage, the kids' tuition." She paused, hearing her voice tremble. "What were you thinking?" He slumped onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. "I don't know," he muttered. It all happened so fast. In that moment, James began to grasp the gravity of his situation. He was up against not just an angry boss, but a moral reckoning. He felt cornered by his own choices. The fear of losing everything, his career, his standing, and possibly the respect of his family, gnawed at him. Over the next 2 days, James was bombarded with calls from co-workers, some supportive, some critical. The pilots' union rep demanded a full account, telling him that if the airline had enough evidence, it might indeed terminate him. Also, local news stations sought interviews, wanting to film the disgraced pilot. James turned them all down. He considered releasing a statement defending his actions, but quickly realized how hollow it would sound. The swirling chaos made him want to hide under a rock. Yet, ironically, he felt more cornered than ever. In New York, the following afternoon, Cassandra Lewis appeared before a gathering of journalists and reporters at Sky Cruise's city office. The space was not overly large, but a cluster of cameras and microphones lined the front row. Dressed in a poised navy blue suit, Cassandra projected serenity despite the tension of the moment. David Connolly stood off to the side, along with other top executives. She spoke calmly, reading from minimal notes. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press, I appreciate you coming here today. My name is Cassandra Lewis, and I serve as CEO of Sky Cruise Airlines. Over the past 24 hours, many of you have heard about an incident at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport involving one of our pilots. I'd like to clarify what happened and share our position. On the morning of the incident, I arrived to board flight 237 to New York. There was a misunderstanding with the pilot, who refused to allow me and, by extension, any passenger he deemed suspicious to board, despite valid documentation. When made aware of my identity, he continued to dispute my right to board. This behavior was unacceptable and does not reflect Sky Cruise's values. At Sky Cruise, we believe in respect, professionalism, and dignity for all. In a world as diverse as ours, it is our responsibility to ensure that everyone, customers, employees, and community members, is treated equitably. That's not just a corporate slogan, it's a promise. We have taken immediate action by suspending the pilot pending an internal investigation. We will not tolerate discrimination or harassment in any form. We remain committed to making air travel safe and comfortable for everyone. I also want to express my gratitude to the ground staff, crew members, and passengers who showed patience and understanding in a difficult situation. My hope is that this event will serve as a catalyst for meaningful dialogue and change within our airline, as well as in the broader aviation industry. Thank you. Her statement was concise, yet firm. Journalists peppered her with questions, some about James Corbyn's fate, others about the airline's diversity initiatives. Cassandra maintained composure, reiterating that an investigation was ongoing and that she respected due process. She emphasized that the key issue went beyond one pilot's actions. It was about creating a culture of inclusion. This measured approach earned praise from several observers, including industry analysts, who noted that Cassandra Lewis was handling a potentially explosive incident with pragmatism and tact. Of course, there were critics who said the airline was simply engaging in public relations damage control, but no one could deny the clarity of the stance she took. While Cassandra addressed the press, James Corbyn sat at home, glued to his television, watching the coverage. His wife hovered nearby, their children tucked away in their rooms. The press conference hammered home the reality that Cassandra Lewis possessed considerable grace and influence qualities. James had failed to see in that fateful moment at the gate. His phone vibrated on the coffee table. It was a text from an old friend at a regional airline who wrote, "Saw the press conference. They're throwing the book at you, buddy. Really sorry." James felt a wave of despair. He had no illusions anymore. The airline, the public, and possibly the entire aviation industry saw him as a problem. Over the next week, matters worsened. A formal letter arrived from Sky Cruise's HR department, requesting that James attend a final disciplinary hearing. Online, news outlets continued to reference the story. Meanwhile, pilot forums debated the situation, with some older pilots siding with James, claiming he was scapegoated in a PC culture. But most recognized that if he had truly disrespected and discriminated against a passenger, even more so, the CEO, he had sealed his own fate. The rumor mill churned out stories that James had a history of being difficult. Some colleagues recounted how he often made snide comments about diversity hires. The skeletons in James's closet were rattling into the open. A few days later, James arrived at Sky Cruise headquarters for the disciplinary hearing. The building loomed tall, reflective windows casting bright glares. He took the elevator to the HR floor, heart pounding. Seated at a long table were Paula Simmons, 2 HR officers, 1 union lawyer, and a representative from the Flight Operations Department. The mood was somber. Paula began, "Captain Corbyn, we've completed our investigation, which includes testimony from gate agent Andrew, ground staff, passenger statements, and video evidence. We also interviewed you at length. Are you prepared to hear the outcome?" James nodded mutely. His mouth was dry. The union lawyer offered a supportive glance. Paula's voice was even. "The evidence clearly supports that you singled out Miss Lewis without cause, challenged her boarding rights, and escalated the situation even after being informed she was our CEO. Furthermore, we have multiple reports that your conduct has been similarly antagonistic toward other employees in the past, though not to this extreme. Considering these factors, Sky Cruise has determined to terminate your employment for cause, effective immediately." Silence. James felt his chest tighten, as if an anvil pressed down on him. Paula slid a packet of paperwork across the table. His severance was forfeited, and his record would reflect termination for misconduct. The union lawyer interjected, "We request an appeal." Paula shook her head. "Appeals can be filed, but we stand by this decision. The airline will also be notifying the FAA of the circumstances, as it pertains to the potential fitness of Captain Corbin to hold certain certifications. That's standard procedure in these cases. Those last words stung the most. The FAA might be informed, possibly triggering a review of James's pilot's license. Without it, he'd be hard-pressed to secure another flying job. His entire career was slipping through his fingers like sand. James rose, a numbness settling over him. He made no more protests, simply gathering the documents. As he left the building, he was met by a small group of curious onlookers, some employees, some from the press. No words were exchanged. He walked past them, feeling the scorching glare of public shame. The next weeks were a blur for James. He tried to contact old colleagues, searching for any airline that might hire him. He applied to smaller carriers, cargo operations, even private charter companies. But the story had circulated widely. At best, recruiters gave polite rejections, citing that they had moved on with other candidates. At worst, his calls went unanswered. The pilot community was surprisingly close-knit, and word traveled fast. Financial stress mounted. Without severance, his savings quickly drained. Their mortgage loomed, and the cost of day-to-day life pressed down. Marjorie picked up extra shifts at her nursing job, a fact that both humbled and shamed James. The children sensed the tension. Their once proud father seemed broken, spending hours in his study, scanning job boards fruitlessly. In those quiet hours, James found himself grappling with the deeper issues at the core of his downfall. He'd always felt overshadowed, especially in a changing corporate environment that valued new voices and diverse backgrounds. He recognized, though late, that his prejudice had made him defensive and combative. He recalled trivial moments where he'd snubbed co-workers simply because they didn't fit his image of a typical pilot or manager. And then his mind always returned to that morning at Gate 49, the moment he allowed frustration, anger, and bias to collide. He could see Cassandra Lewis's face, her calm poise, even as he lashed out. In a twisted way, he grudgingly respected her now. He realized that the confidence she'd shown was not arrogance, but a quiet authority born of skill, integrity, and leadership. Weeks stretched into a month. A union representative told James that an appeal was in motion, but the union's own legal counsel didn't see much chance of success. They advised him to prepare for life outside of skycruise, maybe outside of commercial aviation entirely. That evening, after another fruitless search, James sank onto the living room couch, burying his face in his hands. He whispered, "I did this to myself." No one answered. The house was still. Meanwhile, Cassandra Lewis continued her work guiding skycruise toward higher standards. She initiated a series of programs focusing on unconscious bias training, leadership development, and better channels for resolving staff grievances. Under her guidance, flight crews reported improvements in morale, as well as better synergy with ground and management staff. The media eventually moved on to other stories, but within the airline, the conversation about James Corbin's firing remained a potent example of accountability. One brisk morning a few months later, Cassandra found herself reviewing a stack of employee improvement proposals. She came across a name she half expected never to see again: James Corbin. In one of the proposals, the union had submitted a request for a more lenient outcome for certain employees who faced severe disciplinary measures, including Corbin. They argued that some employees, especially those of older generations, needed deeper, more rehabilitative training rather than instant termination. The union suggested that the airline create a path for redemption or alternative employment under strict conditions. The concept was controversial, but it had garnered support from a few board members who believed in second chances provided. The employee showed genuine remorse and a willingness to change. Cassandra read it carefully, setting aside her personal feelings. She was well aware James Corbin had never apologized to her directly. She also knew how crucial it was to maintain a consistent standard. The airline could not appear to reverse a decision lightly, especially one tied so closely to discrimination. And yet, Cassandra believed in growth. People could change, sometimes dramatically, when faced with the consequences of their actions. She arranged a meeting with David Connolly and Paula Simmons, asking them to evaluate whether there was any benefit to offering James Corbin a carefully supervised route back into aviation, perhaps in a non-customer-facing role initially, with mandatory training and a probationary period. Paula was skeptical, reminding Cassandra of how humiliating the entire episode had been for the company. David was open-minded but cautious, wanting to see a genuine sign of regret from James himself. Cassandra made no commitments. She simply asked them to explore the idea. As CEO, she wanted to ensure they struck a balance, zero tolerance for discrimination, but not zero tolerance for redemption, provided the individual was sincere and the airline's broader interest was protected. Some weeks later, Cassandra traveled back to Atlanta for a corporate function celebrating the launch of a new fleet of eco-friendly aircraft. After the ceremony, she slipped away from the crowd, walking through a quiet corridor in the corporate offices. To her surprise, she spotted James Corbin standing near the elevator, accompanied by the union lawyer. He looked thinner, eyes shadowed with stress. He didn't notice her at first, but when he did, he averted his gaze, his posture stiff. On impulse, Cassandra approached him. The union lawyer politely moved aside, sensing the personal nature of the encounter. "Captain Corbin," she began softly, though the term captain was no longer officially his. "I didn't expect to see you here." He took a moment to respond. His voice was ragged. "I'm here for a meeting with HR. There's a discussion about possible re-employment, though I'm not sure where it'll go." Cassandra nodded. "I'm aware. We've been reviewing your case." A beat of silence passed. James swallowed hard. "Miss Lewis, his voice faltered. He clenched his fists, searching for words. "I want to apologize. I realize it's far too late, but I'm sorry for what I did, for how I treated you. I was wrong." Cassandra studied him, measuring sincerity. She saw genuine remorse in his eyes, a man battered by the consequences of his actions. "I appreciate that," she said finally. "Acknowledging our mistakes is the first step. Where we go from there depends on what we learn." James nodded miserably, eyes downcast. The elevator doors opened, and the union lawyer gestured for James to enter. He managed one last sentence before stepping inside. "I hope, if there's ever a chance for me to prove I've changed, you'll let me." Cassandra offered the faintest of smiles. "That chance won't come easily, but if you're sincere, the door might not be fully closed." He inclined his head, then the elevator swallowed him up. Cassandra sighed as the doors slid shut. She felt no triumph in watching him brought low. If anything, she felt the weight of leadership more profoundly. That day, she discovered that dealing with the fallout of a scandal was not just about punishing wrongdoing, but guiding the entire organization, including those who stumbled toward a better future. The wheels of corporate bureaucracy turned slowly, but eventually the union and Sky Crews hammered out a stringent agreement. James Corbin would not be reinstated as a pilot. The trust required for that role had been irrevocably broken, and the liability risks were too high. However, the airline would consider placing him in a ground-based support position, subject to a year-long probation, mandatory diversity and conflict resolution training, regular performance evaluations, and no possibility of flying in the cockpit unless he completed a fresh certification and was cleared by management. For James, it was a bittersweet offer. He would never again captain a commercial airliner for Sky Crews. But it was a lifeline, a chance to rebuild some semblance of a career, keep his family afloat, and perhaps, in time, recast his reputation. He signed the agreement with hands that trembled slightly, tears of relief burning in his eyes. It was a steep demotion. He'd be making a fraction of his pilot's salary, but it was better than the bleak prospects he faced elsewhere. Cassandra approved the final arrangement, satisfied that it struck a balance between accountability and potential redemption. She had no illusions that James's biases would evaporate overnight, but she took comfort in the fact that he would be under strict guidance, forced to confront his prejudices if he wanted to remain employed. She hoped that through daily exposure to a more diverse environment and the pressure of his own financial responsibilities, he might discover genuine empathy. With the James Corbin saga largely resolved, Skycruise shifted focus to the future. Cassandra spearheaded a revised set of corporate values, making them more than empty slogans by tying executive performance reviews and bonuses to metrics in employee satisfaction and diversity compliance. She increased departmental budgets for leadership training, ensuring that every level of the airline, from ground crew to flight attendants to management, received tools to handle conflicts professionally and respectfully. The airline's reputation rebounded. Many customers appreciated Cassandra's forthright approach, praising her for not shying away from tough conversations. Within a year, Skycruise's passenger satisfaction ratings rose, and the company posted record profits. New routes were launched successfully. The incident with James Corbin became a distant memory for the public, though internally, it remained a cautionary tale. Cassandra continued to visit terminals incognito from time to time, quietly assessing the staff's performance and moral climate. She was often gratified to see greater harmony, fewer complaints, and a sense that employees took pride in working for a company that had stood by its principles. She never again had a pilot attempt to bar her from boarding. Instead, she was greeted with courtesy and often gratitude for her leadership. James Corbin, for his part, spent his days in a windowless office helping coordinate flight schedules. It was unglamorous work, but it gave him time to reflect. He still experienced pangs of regret whenever he saw planes take off or land, remembering the rush of a cockpit he might never occupy again. Yet, as the months wore on, he found small ways to appreciate his new position. He learned new skills, collaborated with younger colleagues, and participated in sensitivity training sessions that forced him to examine his biases. It was far from easy. Some co-workers mistrusted him, but others saw a man wrestling with personal demons, trying to do better. If nothing else, he was polite. Humility had been forced upon him, but it was humility nonetheless. Occasionally, he'd catch glimpses of Cassandra Lewis on the corporate campus. She never flaunted her position. She was polite in passing, sometimes even offering a small, courteous nod. Her presence reminded him of the day his life changed forever, a day shaped by a moment of prejudice and anger, turned into an emblem of accountability. Over time, a sense of gratitude mingled with his regret. The airline's decision not to destroy him utterly, even though he'd nearly destroyed himself, was the reason he still had a chance at a paycheck, a pension, and perhaps redemption. In the end, the confrontation at Gate 49 became one of those defining stories that circulated within the airline industry, especially among training seminars and new hire orientations. Some told it as a cautionary tale about the perils of prejudice. Others framed it as an example of how leadership could respond decisively, but not without offering a narrow bridge back. Cassandra's own reflection, written in a company memo 6 months after the incident, summed it up best. At Skycruise, we encountered an incident of bias that was both personal and systemic. In confronting it, we reaffirmed our commitment to respect and dignity for all. While we parted ways with an individual who betrayed our trust, We also recognize the need to address our culture so that such prejudices cannot flourish unseen. The result was painful for many, but from that pain, we have forged a more united, more principled airline. It is a reminder that mistakes can become pivotal turning points if we have the courage to learn from them. That message resonated throughout the company, grounding the lessons in a hopeful perspective rather than a purely punitive one. Employees felt more confident in the direction Cassandra was taking them. The brand of Sky Cruise shone brighter in the public eye, and internal loyalty grew. As for James Corbin, the hard karma he experienced was not merely the loss of his pilot's stripes. It was the painful introspection that followed a slow, grinding realization that his own flawed mindset had cost him everything he once held dear in his career. Yet out of that hardship, he'd found a path, albeit narrow and rocky, toward rebuilding his life. Whether he would ever fully shed his bitterness and become a changed man was a chapter still unwritten. But one fact stood clear. In that single moment of discrimination, James set in motion a chain of events that led to his downfall. And in that downfall, perhaps, lay the seeds of redemption. When we examine the power of a single choice, few tales illustrate it more starkly than what happened between Cassandra Lewis and James Corbin at Gate 49. A routine morning became a defining flashpoint, demonstrating how prejudice can combust under pressure and how swift leadership can quench those flames with firmness and integrity. This story reminds us that title and position never excuse hateful or dismissive behavior. It also underscores how real leadership, the kind that transforms businesses, comes from guiding values, empathy, and courage to confront wrongdoing. Cassandra's composure in a moment of personal insult highlights the best of what corporate culture should be. James's spiral from pilot's seat to painful introspection reflects the steep cost of prejudice, but also the fragile hope of a second chance. If this story moved you, please consider sharing it, liking it, and subscribing for more stories that spark dialogue and inspire change.